Good evening and welcome to tonight's edition of Resistance TV. We're going to be discussing this evening the extraordinary situation where the Bank of England has seized 31 tons of Venezuelan gold. This has been a cause célèbre for some time now. I remember speaking on the steps of the Bank of England over 18 months ago, where there was a demonstration when this issue first came into the public domain, as it were. And it's been an ongoing running sore ever since. Now, the Venezuelan government has recently taken legal action in the British High Court, which actually ruled against Venezuela getting its own gold back, because this government has recognized an imposter, essentially, a chap called Juan Guaido, who's never stood for election to the presidency, but has simply declared himself the president of Venezuela. Yet Nicolas Maduro enjoys popular support from the vast majority of Venezuelan citizens, but we have a situation where the British government, the EU, the United States have recognized Juan Guaido and have essentially delegitimized the democratically elected Venezuelan government. Of course, Venezuela has the largest oil reserves anywhere in the world. And the United States, starting actually with Barack Obama, have imposed ever-increasing sanctions against Venezuela. And I think what is pretty clear to me anyway is the US are intent on regime change. But the resilience of the Venezuelan people is incredibly inspiring. And despite the United States and Donald Trump's best endeavors, they've stood strong and have refused to yield. This evening, we've got three excellent guests who are going to sort of take us through the background to the situation. There are people who have a lot of experience about what's happening in Venezuela. The first guest is Anya Parampil. She's a journalist based in Washington, D.C. She's produced several documentaries and reported on the ground from the Korean Peninsula, Palestine, Honduras, and Venezuela itself. Second guest is Calvin Tucker. He's the Morning Star's campaigns manager and was one of the international election observers during the 2018 Venezuelan presidential election. And our final guest is Milton Pena. Milton's a retired surgeon who came to the UK as a refugee from the Pinochet regime from his own country of Chile. He worked for many years in the National Health Service, and he's recently returned from Venezuela, where he was working in a voluntary capacity as a doctor there. I wonder if I could perhaps start with you, Anya, because I know that you've reported on the ground from Venezuela. What do you make of this situation where the Bank of England has refused to return 31 tons of gold to a sovereign nation? It seems an extraordinary state of affairs. What do you think's behind all this? What's your take on it?
Well, first of all, Chris, thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you to Resistance TV for hosting this. I love the tag under the Resistance TV logo, 21st Century Socialism, because that, of course, is what Hugo Chavez, the late revolutionary leader of Venezuela, actually branded his own project eventually in Venezuela. That was exactly the term he used to describe what he was trying to implement in the country. As for the recent development in the UK, the decision not to return Venezuela's gold, its rightful wealth, to the country, I think it's par for the course and the exact pattern that's been established since the Trump administration initiated this coup, recognized Juan Guaido and his shadow puppet administration, as I like to call it, last January. Citibank in the United States made a similar decision to liquidate over $1 billion worth of Venezuela's gold after the government was unable to pay back a loan due to sanctions. And this is, I believe, the more I've gotten to know the characters who make up the Juan Guaido shadow administration, and the more I've come to watch their actions very closely and see how this coup developed, I think what we're seeing right now, what you are describing happening in the UK, was the intended outcome and the best result the figures who planned this coup in Washington could have hoped for. Because I was in Venezuela in February of last year, about a month after the United States recognized Juan Guaido. And I was actually surprised the level to which things on the ground felt completely normal. There was no sense that the government was about to fall. There were massive opposition rallies held, but they weren't even really surrounding Juan Guaido. There were plenty of other more veteran opposition figures, such as Maria Corina Machado, who were more passionate in driving up the crowd and who the crowd was more excited about. And Juan Guaido, I came to understand to be a bit of a useful idiot, someone who maybe had so much of a God complex or lack of experience that figures in Washington, such as Carlos Vecchio, his ambassador to the United States, Ricardo Hausman, a figure who worked in the pre-revolutionary Venezuelan government and was representing Guaido at the Inter-American Development Bank, as well as Jose Ignacio Hernandez, his attorney general, who just had to resign last month. I'll get into these figures more, hopefully, as the talk progresses. But I think these individuals understood they weren't going to seize power in Venezuela. They weren't going to succeed in carrying out their coup in Caracas. There are definitely people in the U.S. government who knew so little about Venezuela that they thought it was possible. But these individuals understood, well, if we get the United States and Europe to recognize our legitimacy, then we can actually steal Venezuela's wealth. Forget about the country. We're never going back there. We've failed time and time again to overthrow the revolution. But there's billions of dollars to be had in European and US banks. And these individuals are profiting off of the looting of Venezuela's internationally stored wealth. And so I think this was the kind of theft and piracy, which was the legal framework was established really with this Trump administration coup. Trump and individuals in his administration probably believed Venezuela would be overthrown easily, but there were smarter individuals who thought we can get them to go ahead with this and believe they're going to get regime change, but we can make money in the meantime.
Yeah, no. I mean, Kelvin, perhaps if we bring you in now. I mean, you were over observing the presidential elections in 2018, as I was saying in the intro there. And the Morning Star is probably the only daily newspaper in Britain that actually gives an honest reportage on what is actually happening in the country. I remember speaking to one of your reporters, Steve Sweeney, who was over in Venezuela when there were large demonstrations, and there was lots of publicity in the British media about shortages and alleged violence being meted out by the Venezuelan government. And he contacted the BBC correspondent. You probably know this story. And she was saying that there were terrible shortages. And he said, can we perhaps meet up and compare notes? Because he said, I'm in Caracas. I'm not that far from you. But you're seeing something that is very different to what I'm seeing. I wonder if we could maybe get together and compare notes. Needless to say, she didn't take him up on the offer, but it's a curious state of affairs, isn't it? The whole panoply of the British media seem intent on giving a very distorted picture of the true situation in Venezuela, and if you like, kind of warming up, I suppose, the public opinion in this country to accept what is daylight robbery, and the Bank of England refusing to hand over 31 tons of Venezuelan gold.
Well, indeed, Chris. I mean, it's funny. The BBC indeed does tend to see things that don't exist. I mean, I was reading on their website about 4 or 5 weeks ago, and I was told that the international observers at the Venezuelan presidential elections had expressed serious concerns about its freedom and fairness. It certainly came as a surprise to me, as I was
absolutely
in the international delegation that drew up the final observers report. But of course, it isn't just the British state broadcaster that's at fault here. I mean, my biggest takeaway from observing the elections wasn't what you might imagine it would be, an incident at a polling station or talking to voters. It was actually sitting on the international coach and watching numbers of observers who'd never been to Venezuela before, looking on their mobile phones and reading in the newspapers in their own country that there were no international observers in Venezuela. We simply didn't exist. So we either don't exist, or when we do exist, they put words into our mouths and say the complete opposite of what we've said ourselves to the whole of the international community. And of course, we even wrote to the European Union to set the record straight after that election. I do want to say something about the integrity of the Venezuelan electoral process. Their system isn't just good, it's literally foolproof. I'd like to say it was bomb-proof, but the opposition have actually bombed some polling stations to disrupt previous elections. And the reason it can't be rigged is because it has a triple lock. When a voter walks into the polling station, they vote on a touchscreen computer, so they touch a button. That generates I'll use a prop here, that generates a paper ballot. The paper ballot is put into a ballot box, and at the end of the day, in front of any citizen that wants to walk into that polling station, the ballot box is tipped upside down. A computer printout comes from the computer. The ballot papers are counted. They're compared with the printout, and then the result is sent electronically to the headquarters of the CNE, that's the Venezuelan electoral authorities. And later, the election result, machine by machine by machine, in every single polling station, is posted on the website of the CNE. So if there's a discrepancy between the computerized result, the paper ballot count that has been counted in front of citizens of the local area, witnessed by opposition political parties, or the results as posted on the website of the CNE, hey presto, you've got your fraud. Now, I spoke the night before the election. I was speaking to Henri Falcon's campaign manager. Henri Falcon was the main opposition candidate. I have it on tape. And I asked him, are you going to accept the result of the election tomorrow? And he said, yes, we are going that way. Yes, we will. At exactly 10 p.m. the following day, when the head of the CNE, Tibisay Lucena, announced the result of the election, showing that Maduro had won with a large majority, Henri Falcon tweeted out that the result was fraudulent. So what you can see here is a level of pre-planning, a level of dishonesty, and frankly, a method of encouraging further brutal, murderous sanctions and possibly anything up to and including US military action against the legitimate elected regime of President Maduro. You don't have to like President Maduro. No. But it's not up to the Western powers to make that decision. It's up to the people of Venezuela to make that decision. And every single international election observer from South Africa, representing the electoral commissions, the whole of the African Union, many countries around the world were absolutely unanimous. That was their free and fair choice. And everybody, like him or not, like that system or not, needs to accept that that's the democratic will of the people.
I mean, just on the point about sanctions, Calvin, as Alfred de Zayas, wasn't it, the UN Special Rapporteur, said that they, in his opinion, were illegal and were bordering on crimes against humanity, did he not? And yet, they've, since that time, as I understand it, have actually intensified them. And I remember first reading about the imposition of the sanctions that was ordered by a special executive order of Barack Obama. I can't remember the precise wording of it exactly, but it went along the lines of the justification for it that Venezuela posed an extraordinary threat to the security of the United States of America. I mean, I've never read anything so preposterous in my life before. Perhaps you just briefly comment on that before I bring Milton in.
Well, I mean, it's almost funny. I mean, if people weren't dying as a result of these sanctions, I'd just be tempted to laugh out loud. You make an important point. These sanctions were not begun under the Trump administration. They started under Obama. And of course, history didn't begin in 2015 either. This goes all the way back to when Hugo Chavez was first elected at the turn of the century, and we had the 2002 coup, the oil executive strike, numerous attempts at destabilization, culminating recently in this absurd historical reenactment of the Bay of Pigs. I mean, people are calling it the Bay of Piglets, where these CIA mercenaries try to land on the shore and are arrested by local fishermen. So this has been a 20-year campaign to undermine the legitimacy of the Venezuelan government in order to justify destabilization, massive funding of the opposition through US aid and the misnamed National Endowment for Democracy, try to overthrow the will of the Venezuelan people, seize their oil, and impose a government that's going to fall behind US diktats. The Venezuelan people have clearly said in election after election after election, their answer to that is no. They want their national sovereignty. They want self-determination. And I think it's the responsibility of all of us in the Western countries to speak up, to put pressure on our leaders and political parties.
Yeah. I mean, Milton, if I could bring you in now, I look at Venezuela and I'm reminded of what the fate that befell your country in Chile and the role of the United States in undermining and overthrowing a democratically elected socialist president, Allende, back in 1973. And it seems to me that very similar tactics are being deployed now against Venezuela. Venezuela has managed to hold out, and I think that's a real tribute, frankly, as I've already said, to the Venezuelan people and the support that there clearly is for the democratic revolution that was started under Hugo Chavez in 1998. You've just returned, I understand, Milton, from Venezuela, working there as a doctor. I wonder if you could perhaps give us your observations on what you encountered, what the experience is on the ground, and I don't know whether or not you could comment on whether the sanctions are actually having an effect on the healthcare provision in the country.
Thank you for having me, Chris. It's a pleasure to contribute. I obviously am a Latino American who has gone through the experience of suffered the intervention of the United States in my own country in 1973. And I've seen the parallels certainly with the situation in Venezuela. But the Venezuelan people has been absolutely resolute, and the difference with Chile, one of the fundamental difference is obviously the Unión Cívico-Militar. The army, all the branches of the armed forces in Venezuela are behind what Chavez and President Maduro want to achieve. Obviously, the elites in Latin America, in all the countries in Latin America, in Chile, Peru, Argentina, you name it, Brazil, they have resisted the changes that successive, historically, governments have tried to change the situation, trying to finish with the radical inequalities that exist in these countries. I enjoy my 4-month stay in Venezuela because I live through something that I was unable to live in Chile. And the Venezuelans are, as far as I could see, where I stayed, which was on the Portuguesa state in the two cities, which are twin cities, Araure and Acarigua. I saw more happiness there than I've seen for a long time. They are happy people. They know what is happening to their country. You mentioned the effect of the sanctions on the country, of course, have been absolutely horrendous. They cannot import spare parts for their vehicles, for their machinery, for the equipment in the hospitals. Everything is very difficult to obtain. But it's a double sword. It's a sword with two edges. The opposition is losing ground because the people see through it, see that Guaidó and all this elite is together with the United States trying to bring the country down. So they are losing ground and they are divided. Concerning the effect on the health, these sanctions, which are of course completely unilateral and illegal, they have affected the country health system. Of course they have. But during my stay there, which was interrupted by the pandemic, I was able to work alongside with people that, you know, we are so lucky here having the National Health Service, although it's being destroyed, as we all know. Over there, they would do, you know, everything to try to have a system like the one we're trying to maintain here. I want to say categorically that there is total freedom in Venezuela. Where I was, I went to Caracas, I went to Barquisimeto, I went to Puerto Cabellos. Many people are, as I said, happy people. You can criticize. You know, here they paint him as a dictator. He and his government, they are not dictators by any stretch of the imagination.
No.
Every day I saw the television criticizing Maduro, because of course you got to recognize there is no country in the world that there is people that sometimes take advantage. It happened in this country. We see every week there is somebody who from every political party, they try to take advantage and they are corrupt. In Venezuela, I know there are people that have been found to be corrupt, but the vast majority of the Venezuelan people that govern the country in this moment, they are absolutely true, they're honest, they just want the best. I estimate that Maduro has got easily 60% of the support. There is a 20%, which I referred before, which follow the elite, which are very vociferous, they're very active in every way, externally and internally. And you can see that if you are there. But the vast majority of the people want peace, they want to continue with the democratic process.
Indeed. I mean, you know, the Venezuelan people will be no different to people all over the world, I suspect. You know, they want peace and freedom, and you know, freedom to kind of live their lives and to take care of their families, have a decent job, have a decent lifestyle, decent roof over their head. It's you know, it's a kind of basic kind of human instinct, it seems to me. But I've been really inspired, and obviously you've been on the ground there, by the resilience of the Venezuelan people, people living in the barrios. There does seem to be a sense of, you know, political consciousness, which I would love to see us replicating in many ways in this country, because although obviously Britain is very different to Venezuela, there are many, many challenges. We know from the UN Special Rapporteur's report from, I think it was 2018, that 14 million people in Britain are living in poverty, and Britain by GDP before the pandemic anyway was the 5th biggest economy in the world. And, you know, working class communities in particular, you know, have been hardest hit. And of course, one of the things that Chavez did when he came to power 20 odd years ago was to use the huge oil reserves in Venezuela as a solidarity tool to make sure that the benefits of the oil riches were shared more equitably in the country. And of course, as you'll be well aware, Milton, illiteracy was widespread in Venezuela when Chavez came to office, and yet they eradicated illiteracy by the mid-2000s. But what's the sense of ordinary Venezuelan people that you picked up in terms of their sense of what's happening, the external forces from the United States, their support for the government. You've kind of touched on it a little bit. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about what kind of sense you got from your conversations with, if you like, ordinary Venezuelan people about the situation that has befallen the country.
Well, what I can see is this: the roof over your head is something that everybody has got in Venezuela. I don't recollect in 4 months in anybody sleeping on the streets. You can see that in the United States, which I've been a few times. There is, of course, many people living on the street, like in this country. Over there, everybody got the roof over their head. There is no people asking you for money or anything. Concerning for instance, in the urbanization where I live with a family, the electricity is paid by the state, the water as well. The council, what we could call here the council tax, the collection of the rubbish and everything, that's all paid as well. The schools, the majority of the schools, there is no payment, of course. Most universities, again, I got 5 nephews there and 1 niece. 4 of them, they go to university and is paid by the state. So although the salaries are incomparably small compared to we earn here, people hasn't got that worry of having to pay for their electricity, their water, etc. Now, the other issue that here, obviously we paid, and across the world people paid, is for the petrol. Over there, when I arrived there in January, I was aghast when I went there on a car with one of my relatives, and we went to the petrol station, and he said, well, it's free. It's free, you don't pay for it. Now, I said to him, that surely is unsustainable. He said, well, this had been here even before Chavez was in power, 20 years ago. It has been traditional that because there was so much petrol, the petrol was given free, and it has continued. But I think now Maduro is changing it because he knows that he got to come to have some sort of equilibrium with what the petrol costs internationally, and I think he's taking right step in that direction. But it has to be said, where I was, every day we had lights. The light went off, electricity for 3 or 4 hours. People got used to it because they got to ration it. The other issue is concerning the food, for instance. The club system still work. Where I was, we went every fortnight to get the bag with food, which allows people to get by. So that has been going on for a long time. But across the country, houses being built. I understand the latest figure is 4 million households have got now housing, which they didn't have before over the last few years. And those are the core people that support Maduro because, they would never have had any chance to have to go to university or to have a roof over their heads before. So, but on the other hand, everybody is a businessman. Where I was living in the urbanization, almost every other house, they were selling something because they got to make a living. And people know where they're selling onions, where they're selling eggs, cheese, etc. And they're getting by. They're very, very resilient people.
No, indeed, it's fascinating, and it's really good to get your insights, having been on the ground there only this year. Let me just bring the rest of the guests in now, and perhaps if we bring Anya back, and we'll go to some questions from viewers. But Anya, I wonder whether you could say a few words about why should we care? What would your message be to people watching this who don't know a great deal about Venezuela? Why does it matter to us? I mean, what would you say about that?
Well, Chris, I have to express an agreement with the sentiment you brought up earlier, which is that as a progressive-minded person in the United States who would like to see radical change in my government and would like to see a more democratic and equitable society in the United States, I found that we have a lot to learn from Venezuela and their struggle and the structure which they built there, which both Milton and Calvin touched on, the fact that they're actually building homes for people, providing food for people, and have a more democratic electoral system. They don't have something like the Electoral College or something as bogus as that we have in the United States. So my passion for Venezuela and my desire to defend it comes from my belief that all countries have the right to be sovereign and independent, but also that there's really a model there that I think is worth looking at and certainly worth preserving and fighting for. And then the second reason is just that as a human being I spent 2 months in Venezuela last year, and I saw the level to which people are suffering as a result of sanctions. It is an economic war, economic terrorism. That's the phrase the Iranian foreign minister Javad Zarif always uses to characterize sanctions. He says we shouldn't even use the term sanctions because it implies they're being punished for something, but it is a war that is waged on these people. And I can't, as a conscious person, endorse that. In fact, I have to resist it and fight against it and try to educate as many people about the theft, the true theft that is going on right now regarding Venezuela's assets. And since we're discussing the gold, which was this week or last week seized and now won't be given back to the Venezuelan people, I just want to bring up the case of Citgo Petroleum, because that's a case that I've covered extensively here in the United States. And Citgo really is, just for viewers who don't know, especially in the UK, it's Venezuela's largest, most expensive international asset. It's an oil refinery based in the United States. They actually, up until last year, Venezuela would ship its oil to the US, it would be refined, and then it's distributed at gas pumps all around the United States. It's like ExxonMobil, British Petroleum, any other gas station in the US. And as a result of actions taken by the Guaido administration, shadow puppet administration, that asset, which the Houston Chronicle estimates is worth about $4 to $8 billion, because it's a refinery, it's all of these things, very valuable. That company stands to be liquidated, completely liquidated, in order to pay foreign corporations in return for debt, which international courts, the World Bank Court, says is owed to these companies by the Venezuelan government. And I'm just going to give a brief summary about how that happened. There's this figure, Jose Ignacio Hernandez, the former Attorney General of Juan Guaido. And before he took over as the Attorney General of Juan Guaido, he was a Venezuelan lawyer working in the United States. And there are multiple cases. Right now, there are currently 16 cases lodged against Venezuela at the World Bank's arbitration court. These are from international giants such as Koch Industries, Air Canada. But there were at least 2 of these companies, again, which are suing Venezuela's government, named Crystalex. It's a Canadian mining firm. And then there's another group called OI European Group, a glass company based in the United States. Both of these corporations were suing Venezuela's government because they had property expropriated by the government. They say they were owed this money. And of course, the World Bank rules in favor of these corporations that want to take money from Venezuela's government. But what happened is that because of this choice by the Trump administration to recognize the Guaido shadow puppet regime, these courts had to find a way to pay back these companies with Venezuelan assets already stored in the United States, because Venezuela, the Maduro government, wasn't going to honor these payments. And what do they look to? They look to Citgo because it's a very expensive asset, a lot of money to be made there. But in order to legally justify liquidating Citgo in order to pay back these corporations, these two corporations had to prove that a private US company, Citgo, was actually equal to the Venezuelan government. Mm-hmm. And before the Guaido people took over, there was actually a separation of management between the Venezuelan government and Citgo. They did not directly appoint the managers of Citgo. The Venezuelan government did not manage the day-to-day operations of Citgo. But then Juan Guaido's people come in and immediately, as the administration, appoint the figures and prove the legal arguments that these corporations were making in order to seize Citgo. Now, it turns out Guaido's Attorney General, Jose Ignacio Hernandez, before he took over as Attorney General, was actually paid by these international corporations to testify in favor of their legal argument that Citgo was equal to the Venezuelan government. And then he came in and took action, which proved that legal argument. So this demonstrates how the figures representing Guaido don't actually represent anyone in Venezuela. They represent international industry and capital, and they've actually enabled the theft of Venezuela's wealth. They took legal action again, which only helped the cases of vultures coming now to steal Venezuela's crown jewel on the international stage. And there's just no discussion of this in the Wall Street Journal, in Bloomberg, or any of the capitalist papers, which should be focused on this massive crime and heist. It's really a shame, but it's something I think we all need to be aware of, because it really demonstrates the criminality and also the implications and the plan here to just rob Venezuela, loot Venezuela, and behave like absolute pirates on the international stage. That's who the Guaido administration is, and there should be no question about that.
No, I agree. And I mean, I think as well, for me, kind of neoliberalism was inflicted in Chile and across the continent of Latin America. It was almost used as a kind of guinea pig, really. And, my concern is, and I think one of the reasons why, international solidarity is important. Venezuela today, I mean, kind of, UK, elsewhere, tomorrow, as it were. And it's so important, I think. And the thing I always say to people when I'm ever campaigning on the doorstep during elections and so on is that we, as ordinary working people, have more in common with, similar working class people in different lands and migrants coming to this country than we have with the people at the top of society. Because at the end of the day, the elites, the corporations, their overriding priority, it seems to me anyway, is profits, and kind of the ever sort of implementation of and widespread and exploitation and rolling out of more extreme forms of capitalism at the end of the day. And if that kind of cuts across the interests of ordinary people, well, so be it. And we're seeing that, aren't we? You're seeing it in the United States. We're seeing it in Britain, maybe not to the extreme lengths that we've seen in the continent of Latin America. But the fact, as I've already said, that we have millions of people in poverty in Britain, and you've got significantly greater numbers in the States, which is the wealthiest nation on earth. Something is clearly going wrong. But listen, we've got everybody's up on the screen now, so feel free to kind of jump in as and when, rather than necessarily waiting for me. But let me just put a couple of questions out there, if I may. And perhaps if you want to come back in the first instance, Kelvin, from Kate, Mary, and also Bob Walker. Kate saying, what can we do to try and help Venezuela? And Bob Walker saying, apart from complaining, is there something more practical we can do to stop this daylight robbery? What's your thoughts on that, Kelvin, and indeed Milton and Anya as well?
Thanks. Before I answer that, Chris, can I just pick up on the Venezuelan gold, because I think there's a very important issue here for people living in Britain. The High Court has stated that the British government now recognises as the legal authority of Venezuela the non-existent regime of Juan Guaido. But if you think about it, that judgment is completely ludicrous, because at its most basic, what is a government? It's the people who are in charge of stuff. And in practice, the British government accepts that the legitimate government of President Maduro is in charge of stuff. That's why the legitimate ambassador occupies the Venezuelan embassy. That's why if you have an issue with visas or some other paperwork, you go to the Venezuelan consulate staffed by a legitimate Venezuelan diplomat. So the judgment is completely contradictory and turns the law into an ass, as somebody once said. So what we have is a situation where supine British judges have gifted over £1 billion to a self-declared president who is in charge of nothing other than being the puppet for the United States of America and their attempts to overthrow the actual democratic government. That's the effect of the judgment. They've recognized a puppet and a government that doesn't exist, whose only purpose is to overthrow a legitimate government that actually does exist. And they've given this money to Juan Guaido, which, of course, as we know by looking at past performance, will be spent on destabilizations, will be spent on further coup attempts. And this comes after John Bolton's revelations, the former US hawk working for Donald Trump, his revelations in his book, that Donald Trump himself thinks that Juan Guaido is a loser. I think he called him the Beto O'Rourke of Venezuela, which is just a euphemism for a loser. So this judgment has given a new lease of life and £1 billion to Juan Guaido to carry on destabilizing Venezuela and pushing this violent opposition against all norms of international law and democracy. And that leads me straight on to answering your question, Chris, which is we have a responsibility in Britain. We have a responsibility, number one, because we're the junior partner to US imperialism, and number two, because our own government has organized through the Bank of England to seize Venezuela's reserves. What can people do? Join the Venezuelan Solidarity Campaign, affiliate your trade union branches, your Labour Party branches, any other organisations that you're involved in. Invite speakers to come to your organisations, particularly people who've been to Venezuela or Venezuelans themselves, people who have actual experience and can talk with authority, and start reading the Morning Star, read the rest of the left press, listen to programs like yours or the other social media that's out there, and continue to put the case for democracy, national sovereignty and self-determination. That's the issue. This isn't about supporting or opposing President Maduro. Anybody's entitled to have whatever view they want of President Maduro. This is about Venezuelans' right to choose their own government and their own political system. And if we lose this battle on Venezuela, it has international repercussions all the way through to people like us who live in the Western countries.
Anya, I believe there's a budget line, isn't there, in the federal budget to fund some of the right-wing opposition groups to destabilize the Venezuelan civic society and the Venezuelan government. Is that true?
Well, historically, these Venezuelan opposition parties, beginning with Primero Justicia, founded by Leopoldo Lopez, who currently leads Voluntad Popular, the party which Juan Guaido belongs to, which most of the opposition figures who now work abroad belong to, doesn't have much representation actually in the legally defunct National Assembly. But these groups have historically received National Endowment for Democracy funding. That's the regime change arm of the State Department, the hyper regime change arm, which under the guise of humanitarian assistance supplies agencies all over the world tasked with regime change with funding, such as, for example, the White Helmets in Syria. And the figures who emerge now as the leaders of the Venezuelan opposition, Carlos Vecchio, for example, again, the US ambassador representing Guaido's shadow regime, he is not only someone who actually, before he co-founded Popular Will, Voluntad Popular, with Leopoldo Lopez. he was not only a lawyer for ExxonMobil, representing the corporation in its major legal fights against the Venezuelan government up until it was kicked out of the country. He also, from the time he came back to Venezuela following the revolution, after he studied at the best Harvard Kennedy School, where it's a regime change puppet training ground based in the United States. He was involved in numerous organizations, NGOs, which received U.S. government funding and were behind the 2002 failed coup and failed repeatedly up until they founded Popular Will and really harnessed this extremist right-wing sentiment in Venezuela. That's the group which trained Juan Guaido in the 2007 protests. That was their first. There's only been 2 occasions when Chavismo was defeated at the ballot box. It was during the 2015 National Assembly elections, and then in 2007 when Chavez actually put 21st century socialism on the ballot in order to revive the Constitution. And these students, Juan Guaido among them, trained by U.S. organizations, regime change organizations, led a very it was an ultimately successful campaign in the streets to intimidate people into rejecting that ballot measure. However, in subsequent violent demonstrations emerging in Venezuela in 2015 and 2017, when we saw the really ugly guarimbas, as they're known, they would actually shut down streets, occupy major highways, and prevent major cities from exporting goods, and they would burn Chavista activists alive in the street.
Yeah.
These were very vile civil uprisings.
I've seen some of the footage, Anya, absolutely horrific. And I remember taking some of the senior British journalists to task who attended a fringe meeting at the Labour Party conference in 2017, and they were very critical of Venezuela at the time. I think there were protests and the media was hysterical in this country. And of course, Jeremy Corbyn had been a kind of a supporter of the Chavez government and Maduro for that matter. But I remember taking them to task because they came along to this fringe meeting expecting the Venezuelan ambassador to be there, but she decided that rather than giving them a story, she stayed away. But the point I was making is, why are you not, by all means, if you can identify excesses by the security services of Venezuela, that's your duty as a journalist to kind of report on that. But why is this one-eyed view? Why don't we hear about some of the most appalling extreme violence that you've just touched on there? People being burned to death, people being decapitated, truly shocking stuff. Perhaps you may, any further comments on that, Anya? Is it the same in the States? It's just this kind of totally one-eyed reportage where you only get a distorted view of one side of the picture. You don't hear about all this.
It's by design. Of course, the same corporations which want to exploit Venezuela own the media in the United States. I had similar experiences to Calvin when I was in Venezuela last year, and I was watching a CNN reporter claim there was no toothpaste in Caracas. And then I went to the store on my corner and saw that there was toothpaste. I mean, it's just, they're lying. But I think, at least in the United States, not just on Venezuela, but on a whole host of issues, the public doesn't really trust corporate media, and for valid reasons. That's why Trump really rose to the top by calling out the fake news, and maybe it was a completely cynical campaign, but he touched into a real frustration in the United States, because I think people understand that they have no reason to hate Venezuela, and they were really burned, especially by the coverage in Iraq. So I don't think it will work.
No,
people are more and more
cynical about that, I guess, in terms of the well, certainly I think in this country, and I think that's why more and more people are turning away from the mainstream, so-called mainstream outlets to alternative platforms, and the Morning Star, which is a notable exception of the daily newspapers, actually gives a more balanced position. We're running out of time, and there's a few questions I want to get in. There's one I want to come back to you with, Anya, but let me just bring in Milton, if I may, quickly. There's a question here from a viewer, Milton, and you're saying somebody called Jack T is saying that we're told by our media that because of opposition to Maduro, millions of people are leaving Venezuela and going to Colombia. What's your experience? Is that something that you witnessed? I mean, we've seen this in the news, not so much recently. I haven't seen anyway recently that, but certainly last year there was a lot of talk about people fleeing Venezuela to go to Colombia. What's your experience of that, Milton? Or have you had any experience of that? Can you hear me, Milton?
For me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, my experience is that it is true. Many hundreds of thousands, I understand a couple of millions or more, left Venezuela over the last few years, but they are returning now. I saw the return of thousands of Venezuelans with the pandemic. They came from Peru, from Colombia, and they were received with openness by President Maduro. They were all went into quarantine because the only way to stop the spread of the disease in Venezuela was by being very strict. But going back to what you said, a lot of people that left were professionals. They were doctors, art engineers, etc. Because like when Allende took power in Chile, the professional elites, they're all kind of sided with the elite that ruled the country for years and years to their benefit. So it got to be recognized, and that it was one of the reasons why the health provisions in Venezuela suffered, because they were left without specialists. And it was one of the reasons why I went there and contributed a bit until the pandemic stopped me. But they are returning.
That's very interesting. No, I was going to say that's very interesting, Milton, because we saw, as I've already said, hysterical headlines in the media here. I remember doing a Channel 4 interview with Jon Snow, and he was at great pains to try and skewer me over the issue about people leaving Venezuela to go to Colombia. But of course, the traffic in the past had been actually much more in the opposite direction. It's very interesting that we're not hearing now that people, as you say, Milton, are returning. Where is the media reportage on that? As I say, it's yet another example of the one-eyed view. I just need to bring in a couple of other questions I want to get in before we run out of time. And there's one which I think is important for you, Anya, if I may. It's from Becky Matthews-Massey. She's saying, given what you said, Anya, about Obama's role, what's your thoughts on a Biden presidency? Would he make any difference? Does anyone think in the UK, that Starmer would do any different from the current UK government? And perhaps you could come in on the back of that one as well, Kelvin. But perhaps you start with that, Anya.
Well, just last week, the Biden campaign released a very confusing ad which spliced together virus outbreak and the Black Lives Matter demonstrations. And then at the end, the text emerges on the screen: Fidel, Chavez, Maduro, Trump, leaders all cut from the same cloth. And that was actually written in Spanish. It was an ad in Spanish. And it's airing, according to people who told me online, in Florida in order to gain the right-wing exile vote, which has come to replace the right-wing Cuban population, because as we've seen, as decades went on, younger Cubans actually rejected the positions of their parents and their grandparents, and were actually more open to normalizing relations with Cuba. And that's why the Obama administration actually took steps to do so. On the other hand, Venezuela is the reactionary forces are very fresh in Florida, and they have equal control over the Democratic and Republican Party. Both of these parties are competing for the vote. And Biden actually gave comments to Miami media saying that while he would restore the Obama era policy of normalization with Cuba, he wouldn't hesitate to punish them for their support of Maduro, which just goes to show you, I think, the direction a Biden presidency would go in. I don't believe there would be a backtracking on the recognition of Guaido or on sanctions, unfortunately. And so while a Democrat may not have taken the really stupid step of initiating this coup, which I think in many ways backfired and actually strengthened the support for the government and the resistance in Venezuela. I really believe the policy of recognizing Juan Guaido backfired in that way in Venezuela. But while Democrats won't take the step to do something like that, they have no problem using sanctions, and I don't think they'll walk back the policies of the Trump administration.
It's interesting. I mean, what's grassroots Democrat supporters, members, what's their kind of view? Are they more sympathetic? Or, I mean, I've seen, certainly from what I've seen anecdotally, there seems to be a kind of an awareness and an opposition really to that kind of line that the Biden and the Democrat establishment have taken. Are you hopeful?
I'm hopeful about the public here in the United States. I think even, well, last year, actually, I had the opportunity to go on Fox News on Tucker Carlson's show, which is actually the #1 rated program in the history of cable news, someone who's pretty close to President Trump, and speak out against the Trump administration policy on Venezuela. And I got so many comments, hundreds of comments from people who consider themselves even the right wing and Trump supporters who are against this aggression on foreign nations because they realize that it brings them nothing. They're continuously sacrificed. And then they hear about people suffering abroad based on our policies. So I have faith in the US public, even outside of the Democratic Party. I think there's a growing awareness of the real destruction US policy is waging and how it's not based on any national security threat in the United States. But unfortunately, our parties don't answer to any real grassroots movement. So
I very much agree with that. I mean, the Democrat establishment is competing with Donald Trump to bash Venezuela. I mean, Biden was Obama's vice president, so we don't need to go back very far. We just have to have a look at what Obama did. And Obama, of course, is actually a more progressive, or perhaps a slightly less conservative figure than Biden. When Obama came in, he opened what he called a new chapter of engagement with Latin America. He shook Hugo Chavez's hand. He even gave him, Chavez gave him a copy of Eduardo Galeano's book. But within 6 months, Hillary Clinton, back at the helm at the State Department, and facilitated the military coup against the democratically elected president of Honduras. That was in 2009. And of course, as I pointed out earlier, it was Obama himself who signed the first set of sanctions against Venezuela. So I think if people are looking towards the Democrat establishment to get the world and the Venezuelan people out of that mess, they'll be looking a long time. And I think the lesson is we need solidarity with Venezuela in the US, in Britain, and everywhere.
Guys, thank you very much indeed for that, Kelvin. Guys, we're out of time. It's really flown by, and there are many questions building up, but we're out of time. And your point about the Democrat establishment there, Kelvin, I think is also apposite for the UK as well. And regrettably, we have an establishment inside the British Labour Party, which leaves a lot to be desired in terms of its foreign policy positions. And when I was in the House of Commons, even under Jeremy Corbyn's leadership, the Parliamentary Labour Party were less than fulsome in their support for the Venezuelan people. And I remember asking a question when there was a statement about the Venezuelan gold, funnily enough, and I was putting a question to Alan Duncan, who was the minister at the time in the Foreign Office, and I was jeered as loudly, if not more so, by was on the Labour benches than I was on the Tory benches. So there's a big job for us to do in terms of changing the mindset of the political class. But like Anya and like you, Calvin, and indeed Milton for that matter, I'm optimistic about the wider general public. And I think it's up to us to try and encourage people, to inspire people, and to raise expectations, to raise political consciousness, and to stress the importance of solidarity both at home and internationally. Can I thank Anya, Calvin and Milton for an absolutely brilliant programme. I've thoroughly enjoyed it anyway. I hope people who have been watching at home have. If you haven't been able to catch the full broadcast, it is going out on YouTube, so be able to rewind it and watch it on YouTube. Thank you very much indeed for watching Resistance TV this evening, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you and good night.
Chris.
Yep.
Thank you, Chris, for